Welcome to How Ecology Works. In this podcast, we cover all topics in ecology and how you might apply them in your future career.
All right, we're back again with Morgan Varner, and Morgan Varner has been working in our field for a long time and studied various aspects of fire ecology and plant ecology. And today I wanted to talk to him about something that he's really an expert on, and I think he could provide some really useful context about. And Morgan, I appreciate you taking some time to talk with us. Maybe you could briefly tell us who you are and kind of what you do in our field, but I really would like for you to tell us more about how trees respond to fire, maybe something about those traits, and then particularly post-fire tree mortality.
Great. Well, thanks, Marcus. I'm Morgan Varner. I'm the Director of Research at Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee, Florida, and I'd consider myself broadly a fire ecologist. I work in all aspects of fire, from fire behavior to social impediments to fire. But really, I came to this field, and a lot of it was about tree mortality. Like many people who thought about how fire interacts with vegetation, it's impossible to not say, how in the world do some trees live and some trees die at a real basic level. And it's always intrigued me, and I ended up spending my master's and PhD research at Auburn and University of Florida, respectively, looking at this topic, and have always gravitated to trying to understand how a plant that is literally rooted, it can't escape, how in the world plants could survive when fire is around them, when heat is being subjected to something that clearly can't tolerate heat. And so it's always been, it's a conundrum for a plant to be rooted and to have to suffer through the injuries that fire can sustain.
Well, I think something that's really interesting about this is that at face value, it seems like it's really obvious, like, oh, that plant died or this plant lived. But some of the conversations that I've had with you and some of the work I've looked at, it's not always that obvious. So, I mean, you literally have been working on this line of research for a long time, right? Yeah. And you focused on it and still learning things about it. So
yeah, and I think that's it's a, in some ways it's understanding how plants work, and that is, in a lot of ways with tree mortality research, it's literally from cells to landscapes. There's a lot of information on how plant cells in isolation respond to heating. Intracellular within a cell, how what heat does, all the way to how individual trees in a cluster would interact if they're heated, and then over time and over space, how mortality might progress. And I think that's the exciting part, melding that with how fire would and how heat would be distributed, both at the cell or leaf level all the way to the whole plant, and then into spatially structured communities. The thing that I think about with that is exciting about tree mortality is there are some pretty clear patterns. And so I've lived around the U.S. and worked in lots of fire-prone ecosystems, and there are some emergent characteristics of tree mortality. And historically we developed, our community developed prediction for post-fire tree mortality. And that's originally in the sort of 1940s, 1950s, it was a fire occurred and we need to make salvage decisions. And so they built models that would look at the injury that the tree had sustained, something about how the crown was injured, like crown scorch, that browning of the foliage that takes place after fire, something about how the stem or the bole was injured, and that is usually reflected in the charring that takes place on the surface. And then something about the below ground, and that has always been, because it's obscured by soil, it's a really difficult thing to get at, but different measures of those injuries, and collectively how that would affect the probability of plant survival. So from a salvage standpoint, deciding whether to cut a tree because it will likely die, And that's a really cool part about post-fire tree mortality is the fire doesn't occur today and it's clearly dead today. What tends to happen is they just suffer a lot of injury. And so you have this protracted, sometimes years or decades often, where they will just be in this state of decline, where they're sort of insult, injury, insult, injury, insult, injury on their way to eventual death. So they were developed for salvage. And then we very quickly, in that period, if we can build a model to tell what, in the aftermath of fire, if a tree is going to live or survive, couldn't we use it as a predictive tool? And in a lot of, natural resources and applied ecology, that's our value, is our model to tell the future. It's a crystal ball. Can we take something that is so diverse and generate a prediction? And so the models very quickly went from
a useful prediction.
Yeah, useful prediction. Yeah. And so from a prescribed fire standpoint, how we ignite a fire and how that fire selects individuals to live or die is really, really critical. And so it made it a much more difficult enterprise. So we now have 6 or 7, 8 decades of large data sets that have looked at species across the world, and we've been working on a team to look at these models for North American species, and we have a database of 80-something species with 70-something thousand trees. And when you look at large data sets and the glory of us having people so interested in this topic from so many different areas and so many different species, is you start to see emergent patterns. We've always known that post-fire crown injury that is reflected as crown scorch is the primary predictor, and individual species will be more or less sensitive to it. But this large database we built shows the power of that single predictor, crown scorch predicting mortality, and in general most species across a scorch spectrum from a little bit of browning of the foliage to complete browning, they'll have a differential pattern by species, showing that scorch is really, really strong. And that has some real advantages and some disadvantages. Scorch tends to be short-lived on a lot of species. So longleaf pine, Pinus palustris, a species that I work on the most, the dang thing starts to show or reveal that the leaves were scorched almost the day of burn. You'll start to see a slight color change, and then that color change will modify over the next 10 to 14 days. And by 2 weeks, you can really see the leaves that were killed. Those leaves that were killed only stay on the tree until about 4 or 5 weeks post-burn. So now you've got 2 or 3 weeks to make that measurement. And after that period, they drop the leaves. And so you lose the ability, the very best predictor we have, you lose the ability. So it's a short-lived, awesome indicator. And so lots of species show this really strong scorch pattern, which has its own sorts of stories. But we've also looked at injury to the stem itself. And when I first learned about tree mortality, that was always the thing that I went to. My knee jerk was, well, this is a thin-barked species. It has not very much defense, because I came at it as a plant ecologist thinking about it like herbivory. It doesn't have very much defense, and so the poor thing perished. But the way that bark is structured, the differences among species, etc., all are really good predictors, and for that conduit from heat from a fire to make it across that bark surface to strike the underlying cambium. And then the last one, and what I've spent my PhD research on, was looking at below ground heating. It's overlooked for some obvious reasons, but in lots of ecosystems, boreal forests, and many frequent fire systems that have fire excluded for decades, surface fuels will decompose to become ground fuels like duff, heavily decomposed litter that during a typical surface fire is not a big issue, but when it's accumulated as duff, has the ability to smolder, and that smoldering can be hours to days following the original ignition. And because of its proximity to the soil surface, it conducts heat to surface roots. And there's certainly some thresholds for their ability to survive that sort of injury.
Would you say that that's relatively unnatural for the plant? Is that when in a community where that's been fire suppressed, for instance, and the duff has built up to a larger degree, so the plant traits that you were talking about to protect the plant from fire, not necessarily as well developed for that particular type.
Yeah, so it's almost a novel disturbance for those species.
So they're fire adapted species, but they're in a really weird context.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's for a system like longleaf pine that has historic fire return intervals, as developed by fire scar evidence and others, they tend to be annual to biennial fires. And to shift that to 50 years without fire, for instance, clearly it's going to be there'll be novel fire behavior, and in this case, novel fire effects. And the work that we have, in general, across tree mortality, larger trees survive more than smaller trees for bark reasons, for their height above the flames. But in this below ground work, in this duff burning, the largest trees suffer mortality greater than all other sizes, because those trees tend to have the greatest accumulation of duff. And so it's a totally novel and often an unintended consequence of sort of reintroducing fire, which has so many wonderful connotations, but in this case has a really negative outcome.
So for a predictive standpoint, there are a couple of things I wanted to circle back to, but you brought up something I found very interesting that stimulated thought right then. Are you saying that some of these predictive models, if you're in a context where fire has not entered the system in a long time, we would actually predict the opposite mortality pattern than is observed?
You got it, yeah. It's totally fascinating. We, in our large database that we just built, we use the standard models of mortality that were developed primarily in frequently burned systems. And there are a few species that really stick out like a sore thumb that don't work, basically. The models don't work. And one of those was longleaf pine, the most fire-adapted species in North America. If you're reading an international fire ecology textbook from South Africa, there'll be a picture of longleaf pine from the southeastern U.S.
Yeah, the quintessential fire-adapted
It is. It's certainly iconic. And for it to behave so poorly, and it is just this factor that the trees that you would predict to survive, all else equal, in the case of fire exclusion, are the trees that have the greatest probability of death.
That's really, really interesting. And what you described in a little detail, how important it is to be able to predict, but just to put that in the forefront, I mean, depending on what your objectives are, a private landowner probably wants to know pretty well if they're going to implement a practice, whether or not they're going to impact their timber crop, right? But it also, from an ecological standpoint, could be pretty important. Not only, does that tree sustain damage and potentially become habitat for animals, or, even if it dies, it could also impact habitat for animals that need a dead standing tree. And then, of course, when it becomes a part of the fuel, it starts impacting fire regimes and the way the system's functioning. So there are lots of reasons that you would want to be able to predict that, but that's pretty stark that your research has actually shown that we would predict that wrong just based on how long it's been since there was fire.
Yep. It's a real, sort of one of these classic unintended consequences type things that are the most damning in applied ecology. Like,
yeah,
this should have worked better.
We really missed that one.
Yeah. Well, something that, in this, as we've sort of broken apart post-fire tree mortality in this way, one of the things that we've come to is starting to delve a little bit deeper into each of these. And
into the duff.
Yeah, exactly. I went down in the soil there earlier, but one of the things, because scorch is so common, it's been really taken for granted. And some of our recent work, and part of this is just high frequency observation. Ecologists, sometimes we go in the field for a couple days, or we go for our, quote unquote field season, and we miss what happens in that intervening period. And I was mentioning how rapidly scorch disappears. Something that we've noticed as we started to track daily scorch. So we burn a site, well, rather than going back and we know it'll appear scorched in 4 weeks, we started to go daily, started to go morning and afternoon, and start to look at scorch, and it's caused all these sorts of aha discovery type moments, causing us to question what scorch is. What happens to the nutrients that we know are concentrated in those leaves, like nitrogen? If a leaf is falling in the autumn, as it usually would, and it's, instead of doing that, it's following scorch, is the the nutrients in those leaves, is it falling to the surface of the forest floor? Does the plant have the ability to retranslocate the nutrients that are in those leaves before they senesce? What are the ecological consequences to the ecosystem of if they're not retranslocating, then they're being dumped on the forest floor in a period that is following fire, and so the surface pH, the heat, the blackness of the soil surface, all these things that are interacting with decomposition, it really opens up a lot of really cool ways to look at something as simple as a tree died or it lived. And that kind of binary approach to how we've thought about tree mortality in the past is confronted with, this is a lot more difficult than we thought. And I think there's a lot of stuff like that with tree mortality that's wide open.
Well, it seems, just the topic, like I mentioned up front, it seems like a pretty cut and dry, simple topic, but what you've just listed is basically that it could have important implications on the entire function of the system, right?
Absolutely.
In many ways.
Yep.
So that's really cool. Thank you for giving us some strong background on this topic. I really appreciate you taking time to tell us about the stuff that you work on, and I certainly learned a lot about tree mortality, and I hope everyone else did as well.
Great. Thanks so much.